The WikiLeaks chief is an unlikely icon of modern-day journalism. But in the last few months alone, has come to be feared by the world's most powerful countries and their rulers, especially the Americans, whose anger he cares little about. Now fighting a battle of his life in courts, aware that the Americans, whose inner secrets he's exposed, want to silence him, Julian Assange opens up to Times Now's editor-in-chief, Arnab Goswami. The setting for this rare meeting is temporary home in Norfolk County, 3.5 hours away from London.
Mr. Assange, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you. You're an icon of journalism.
Thank you.
People look up to you. And I don't know if you're aware, but what WikiLeaks has been doing through the India cables has been making a lot of news in India, especially over the last 45 odd days. Have you been following that?
Yes, we have been following that. And we're, of course, extremely proud. I mean, this is what we all long for and hope for in our work, is to see this kind of effect. And perhaps we've seen similar level of effect in the Middle East, but really the spectrum of material that has come out in India is exactly what we've hoped for. So far there's been 21 front pages of the Hindu, and of course the material is played out in many other ways in the Indian media.
Is it important to you that these cables have an impact? Because you put out the cables in form, sort of the raw sense of it. There's no interpretation to it. Do you look forward to a certain impact? For example, in the case of India.
Well, what we promise our sources is that we will try to get the maximum possible political impact for what they're doing. You have to remember, people who are coming to us are sometimes coming to us with a great risk, with incarceration, persecution, or execution. So we represent them like a lawyer represents a client to a court. We represent whistleblowers to the public. And what we're trying to do is make sure that the efforts that they go to have the biggest possible impact. And our activity is sort of geared and structured around that way, and that means making very specific deals with different media around the world, promoting things ourselves, doing interviews like this one, to try and raise the level, raise the credibility of the material that we get.
Those who get hurt by the publication of your cables read motives. For example, in the context of India, the India cables primarily, which have come out so far, at least the first part of it,
yes,
was seen to be completely anti-American and also exposing members of the Indian political establishment who were too eager to please the Americans. Can a motive be read there?
What we do is provide people with the truth. Now that is not our interpretation of the truth. It's very interesting. We are in both an extremely difficult position in that we take information which has the maximum possible censorship on it. If you look at the reactions to us by the Pentagon, by the State Department, by the CIA, we have our own publicly declared CIA task force into us. Of course, it is difficult to publish this sort of information. On the other hand, we have structured things in such a way that we also have journalistically quite an easy job. That is, either the material we are publishing is a legitimate government document or corporate document, or it is not. What is inside the document in terms of its contents, what the State Department is saying about India, about other ambassadors, or what a banking organisation is saying about its clients, that is an internal matter that journalists then have to check over, crawl over, and the public itself to understand what that means for a country, or what that the allegations mean. But for us, things are relatively easy. We just say, is this a true document? Is this a false document? And that's a black and white decision for us. So we're able to deal with this very hard case of publishing material that superpowers do not like, in part because the journalistic part of understanding is something true or false is very, very simple.
Not every detail is known of this young Assange's growing up years. As a child, he moved around a lot and showed his irreverent streak very young. At 16, he formed a hackers group called the International Subversives. A name that to an American diplomat would have seemed apt today. Now touching 40, Assange doesn't like being called a computer hacker. Something his critics like to describe him as, for obvious reasons.
Let me just step back a little bit, Mr. Assange. What did you set out to do when you started this whole journey? What really was the driving factor that you had?
Since the early 1990s, I've been involved in publishing things that were difficult to publish. And I understood that bringing the internet to people, bringing information to people, educating people about how their world actually works is something that tends to make the world more just. And so, like many other individuals, I want to live in a nice place. And when I see something around me that is unjust or inhumane, I feel that the world around me is not a pleasant place for me to live in. So I wanted to take this things that I had done and had learnt from, some of my political understanding, technical understanding, and the contacts that I had made in human rights work, in cryptography, intelligence agencies and journalism, and pull them all together and solve what I saw as the biggest problem that I could solve, which was people not knowing how political and corporate institutions in a modern era actually behave. Because we need to understand how they actually behave if we are to deal with them. And in the end, it really is these institutions that control very large parts of our life and the direction that human civilization is moving in. I see that there are three types of history, and all our work as a civilization is based on these three types. So one is information that has an economy behind it. So some of that is extremely important information, such as how to pump water, how to create penicillin. Very, very important human information. But there exists an existing industry around that. The other is information which people no longer care about. Books say that have published 100 years ago, perhaps information is important, but there's no industry around it. On the other hand, no one is trying to destroy that information either. And there's a third class of information, which is the information from within major institutions that people are actively trying to suppress from the public. That type of information is something that we've never really known before, that human civilizations have never really known. Going all the way back to ancient Greece, we've never really known that information because people have been working to keep it away from the public. And why do they work to keep it away from the public? Well, because they believe it will do something if the public knows. What will it do? Well, the public will take it and use it to reform those very institutions. And if we want accountable, just human institutions, then we need to understand in all the ways in which they are not being accountable, in which they are not being just. And once we have this understanding, then we can both address specifically individual acts of injustice, but we can also get a feeling for how they behave as a whole, for how systems of patronage work, systems of bureaucracy, international geopolitics. And I say, until we understand how these systems work, there cannot possibly be a political prescription or philosophical prescription into fixing those problems. So to that extent, all existing political philosophies are bankrupt because they are built on not understanding how human institutions actually behave in the modern era. We have to first understand how our institutions are behaving before we can come up with programs to reform them all.
Isn't the definition of what is just and unjust a very subjective thing?
No, I don't think this is I don't think this is subjective at all. I mean, when we look at children around the world playing with toys, and one child is playing with a toy and another larger child comes and takes the toy away, well, there's a feeling within the child that that was unjust. Similarly, when people are arbitrarily killed, there's a feeling this is unjust. Now, I say, and evidence shows that in general around the world, that feeling about what is just and unjust actually is pretty common. It's only when we get to the more complex and ornate cases that people start to differ. And when we start to build up some kind of intellectual construct on these feelings of injustice. But the basic feelings of injustice, that if one person is full and another person is starving and they're sitting side by side and that is unjust, that's something that is common amongst many, many people.
When you were 16, you started off with hacking, and it was under the name of which meant nobly untruthful. Why did you? Can you just explain that? What you really meant by nobly untruthful? And you also there was a name which you gave to your group, which was International Subversives.
Well,
now that sounds extremely dangerous.
Well,
what were you setting out to do then?
We were, teenagers trying to understand the world within international context actually, but especially from within Australia, which is sort of fairly isolated. This is pre-internet. No, what we were trying to do is understand how these big systems worked, and also challenge them, find things that were unjust. And I ran a magazine from that, and we ended up being prosecuted as a result of that magazine. That took 6 years in court to get out of it. The nobly untruthful, it's just a play. If you use a pseudonym, well, it's not your real name, so it's just a sort of a clever play on the Latin words.
Okay, I want to ask you a few questions in the context of India. I don't know how much you've been following what has been happening in India, Mr. Assange, but we've had a series of scams. Now, every time, and people in India would like to know your views on this, every time there is a scam in India, the government sort of steps in, or whoever's affected steps in and tackles that issue in what is seen to be a piecemeal way. It's more damage control. Handle one scam at a time, put it up to some process of inquiry, ensure that it is away from constant media attention. In your view, how long will this sort of approach last?
I'm not sure. When we started releasing these cables about India, we showed two things. One is what was actually in the material. So the various scandals that have come out, the relationship with the United States, the bribing in Parliament and so on. The other thing that we revealed was what the government reaction to all that was, what Prime Minister Singh's reaction to all that was, and other people. So we can see two types of information coming forth, and both of these are quite important to understand how these organisations are actually behaving. So I agree with you, the response by the government left a lot to be desired. I said before that it was clear to me that Prime Minister Singh was deliberately attempting to mislead the Indian people on what type of material this was. People tell me that he is not personally corrupt. I do not know myself. I have no information on that as to whether he is or is not. But his reaction left a lot to be desired. It wasn't to fully, frankly investigate what was going on and then provide findings to the Parliament. Rather, it was an attempt to spin the issue. And I suspect that has come from experience in dealing with similar scandals in the past. That is a way you can deal with them. You try and spin them, then you localise an investigation and a response. If we are to have a strong response from the government, it will require a strong response from media. I mean, they just have to be pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed until they see that there is an advantage in performing a proper response. And that's what will drive these people. I mean, I understand from running an institution which is constantly under attack from state actors and from critics that you do try and put out the biggest fire first.
Mm-hmm.
So the absence of the Indian government to comprehensively respond does not necessarily mean that they will not, or they have all sorts of vested interests in trying to shirk the issue. A large part of it, no doubt, is that they have many fires to put out, like all big institutions, and so they simply put out the biggest fires that they can, and then they turn their consideration to the smaller ones. So if we want the Indian government to really address corruption, then it must become the central issue of the nation. So it cannot simply give these small concessions or small investigations or push something off to a parliamentary committee. And that actually seems like it may be on the cards.
Coming up, Assange tears further into the Indian government's response to the WikiLeaks disclosure and tells the story of how Hillary Clinton coached the Indian government's response. When asked by Arnab how sure he is, Assange looks totally confident.
Hillary Clinton, members of the State Department, did in fact approach the Indian government in December.
That story on the other side. Never before has Julian Assange spoken as much or in so much detail about Swiss secrets as he does in this part of the interview. Yes, there are Indians in the secret list, he says.
There are Indian names in data that either we have already published or we are going to publish.
He's being offered a deal to buy his silence, he reveals.
I can't tell you anything more at this stage.
But on the issue that enrages millions of Indians, the Indian government needs to change its act, he says.
There's no reason why India shouldn't be as aggressive. In fact, maybe it should be more aggressive.
This part is being run unedited on Times Now.
The biggest issue in India today is, the secrecy on Swiss banks, and I'm sure you are aware of the public interest in India about it. This is a debate that's been going on for 3 decades. What do you think about it? About the secret Swiss bank accounts. I'm sure you've heard about the enormous amount of ill-gotten Indian wealth which lies in Swiss banks.
I have seen a report from this, it may have been EU as opposed to Swiss, but an official report saying that there are more Indian deposits in Swiss banks than any other nationality. So that should be a concern. In the work I did in Africa, I discovered that $3 billion had been sucked out of Kenya and pushed around the world, including into Swiss banks. And it struck me that this was much worse than local corruption. Because when you have local corruption, when someone steals from a ministry and puts it into their company, say within India, and then spends it in India, well, even if the government is losing the money, at least the people of India are not losing the money.
Absolutely.
But when the money is taken and it's pushed offshore, then every time someone sends $1 million to a Swiss bank, they are buying Swiss francs and they're selling rupees.
Yes.
And the result is that the currency of the nation is debased. And so that there's a double effect in the corruption.
Completely.
Everything for all Indians becomes more expensive as a result of that transfer. We, a few years ago in 2008, published a series of accounts of Swiss bank holders in the Cayman Islands. And the Cayman Islands was being used by people around the world to hide assets and to evade tax. In order to open one of these bank accounts with the bank Julius Baer, the largest private Swiss banking concern, one needed at least $1 million in cash. So this is not, when we speak about banking here, we're not talking about normal banking. And that's a defense that these banks often use. They say, oh, you like your bank account to be private, don't you? Well, this is just the same sort of thing.
Exactly.
This is absolutely not the same sort of thing. It's wrong to call this banking. It is something else. It is asset hiding. And they use laws in Caribbean islands like the Cayman Islands. They use complex trust structures. It is not anything like a normal bank account. They position lawyers,
transfer funds,
transfer funds all over the place. Make sure there's no accessible names. Use secrecy laws, etc. And the only reason why you would be wanting to put your money into a Swiss bank-controlled place like the Cayman Islands is to hide assets. It's actually quite expensive to do. You need, looking at the documentation we saw in that period, it was about 15 to 25,000 US dollars per year just to keep the account. Why would someone be paying so much money?
Absolutely.
To do that?
No, but it happens. There's a cloak and dagger way to it. I mean, I don't know if you've heard the case of Hassan Ali, India's biggest tax swindler. He's currently in jail. In one account alone, he had $8 billion. And then later, when the government went to find out, they found one day there was $60,000 left, and the other day there was none. So the money had been taken away. Now, Mr. Assange, the argument the Indian government has given so far is that there are rules. You know, there are always two arguments that governments give. One is national security, and the other is international rules and protocol. On international rules and protocol, they say there's a double taxation avoidance agreement with Switzerland, which we must respect. With other European countries, we must respect. We cannot break those rules. But there is a strong view in India today that if the governments on both sides want, they can change the rules. So it's a system of patronage, isn't it?
Of course they can. I mean, I had a Swiss bank account.
Did you? How much do you have in it?
So, well, let me tell you, I had a Swiss bank account, not with Bank Julius Baer, but with the post office in Switzerland, who also runs bank accounts.
Yes.
And my Swiss bank account was closed down like that as a result of US pressure. That was a publicly declared bank account designed to raise funds for our legal defences. Closed down like this as a result, within 4 days of Cablegate. So it's simply not true that these organisations and governments can't come up with alternative proposals if there's the political will to do so.
So this whole argument of double taxation avoidance agreements is not something you buy.
Double taxation doesn't have anything to do with asset hiding.
Yeah.
So it just simply doesn't cover asset hiding. In terms of putting money offshore, it can cover that, but the citizen concerned can't be Indian. So I mean, we have had a similar issue in Australia where most of the share owners of the mining companies were from overseas, from the United States, and the dividends were being paid off to the United States, and so there was no tax on all those dividends. And the Australian government decided that it would introduce a special tax on the mining companies because the mining industry was making so much money and other industries weren't. It was completely possible to do. The Australian government decided to do it, although quite interestingly in its case, the mining lobby then all got together and rolled the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and put another person in his place, Julia Gillard. And the cables we released showed some of the scheming that had been going on to roll the Prime Minister. So, see, in the Australian case, it was perfectly possible to do legally. It wasn't possible to do politically. And the Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, lost his Prime Ministership as a result.
Now, on the 17th of January 2011, you had this press conference in which Elmer gave you 2 discs of data in front of reporters. And he said about how this system, the Swiss system, runs exactly what you're saying. He said it damages society. And since then, Mr. Assange, people across India have been waiting to know when this information will come out, because it has the potential of correcting one of the greatest ills of our system.
Well, let me tell you what has happened in relation to that. So normally we only deal with anonymous sources. Mr. Elmer and his legal team, for reasons of their own, which I don't understand, decided they wanted a public press conference. he then returned to Switzerland and was immediately imprisoned while an investigation has been taking place. And he is still in prison at this moment. He has not, as far as I am aware, been charged with anything. He is simply in prison during the period of the investigation. And we have had an indirect, an offer through a third party that if we return what they believe to be the data, what that Swiss bank believes to be the data, then they will work to permit Mr. Elmer to be free. Okay. So my ability to talk about that subject is, of course,
so you're
limited by the fact that this Swiss bank has a hostage.
So it's a difficult situation for you. It's, you know, the person who's given you the information is a hostage, and as of now, because of that, you're being held back from making this information public.
Well, I obviously cannot say whether there was information on those CDs, what sort of information it was, but yes, it is a very difficult situation for us that he is effectively being held hostage. Let us not forget that Switzerland, about 50% of its GDP comes from banking activities.
Yes.
The last case we did, 2008, regarding the Swiss bank Julius Baer, they tried to close us down. They went to a California court. Yeah. It was a very, very big case. In the end, we won, and it cost them approximately $300 million in lost profits. They had to cancel their US operations and so on. But Mr. Elmer was followed around by private investigators. That is fully documented and proved, paid for by the Swiss bank. It's a difficult business.
You have strong views on it, and I completely appreciate that you cannot talk about this in detail. But let me ask you more generically, that in your heart, you would like to reveal the details. In your heart, I'm not asking you when or in what circumstances, but having known about it, you would like to reveal the details of how the system operates, wouldn't you?
Well, we have various types of information about different banking operations in the world. Over time, we have revealed those. In fact, most of the legal attacks on us have been from banks. Banks in Scotland, banks in Dubai, banks in Iceland. We have all received legal attacks from these banks. And we will continue on publishing data about these banks as soon as we're able to do so.
Have you encountered any Indian names? I'm not asking you to tell me where, which banks
yes,
or which cities.
There are Indian names in data that either we have already published or we are going to publish. I can't remember specifically whether the Indian names in upcoming publications, but I have read Indian names. Similarly, in these private Swiss banking concerns where you need at least $1 million, so it is a significant amount of money, not an average Indian.
And it's difficult to identify those names. Anything more you can tell us about?
I can't tell you anything more at this stage. As we go through the process of releasing data, it is always that we have to do extra research,
yes.
And then once we understand which media organisations are best placed to help us with that research, then we operate with them. But we're not at the stage yet that I know all the research that is going on.
To all our Indian viewers, just one point: should they lose hope that the names will come out? I mean,
no.
At one point, what would you say to them?
They should absolutely not lose hope. I mean, it's quite interesting. There are different forces at play here. I mean, the German government in particular has been very strong in that there needs to be more transparency about banking operations. It has gone so far as to buy CDs off people in Liechtenstein and so on to reveal this information. A very, very aggressive approach by the German government. And the German government is the dominant power within Europe. So those German attitudes are gradually seeping in to Europe as a whole. The United States has also been applying some pressure in relation to UBS tax evaders. So the problem is that as Swiss bank accounts are opened up. There's simply other ways to deal with the situation. So you go and register a trust in, say, Charles, and the trust then opens a Swiss bank account. Well, you might know who owns the Swiss bank account, but what's there is a trust in, say, Charles. So then you have to break the trust in, say, Charles. That is a problem throughout the offshore sector. It's quite hard to deal with. You can sort of get it through regulation, investigation. You kind of get this at the level where, although people can hide their assets in this way, the amount of expense and effort and risk involved in the asset hiding doesn't make it worthwhile.
But given the economic and political clout that India wields, any reason India should not be as aggressive?
No, there's no reason why India shouldn't be as aggressive. In fact, maybe it should be more aggressive because India seems like it's losing per capita much more tax money than Germany.
Mr. Assange, at the very end, you have become an unlikely journalistic icon. You're changing the rules of the game. Do you think there will be others like you? Do you think this form of journalism that you're putting out, today, which you've sort of, I would say, copyrighted, but this is a form of journalism that is yours, that is solely identified with you and your movement. Do you think this is a form of journalism which will change the rules by which the fourth estate operates in the future?
Well, we have a lot of people that are trying to do similar things now that have been inspired by us. Mostly they haven't got anywhere yet. These are at very preliminary stages, but we know about 30 different attempts to do things a little bit like we're doing. People are concentrating wrongly, I think, on the leaking side, protecting sources coming in. That's very important, but it's only useful if you can publish. So the New York Times, as an example, is going ahead and trying to build its own sort of system to protect people bringing in information. But the problem is there's a wide class of information the New York Times simply will not publish. So you actually need both of these, getting information in and also getting information out. But I just earlier today spoke to some people in Kyrgyzstan, and there's a little Kyrgyzstan online newspaper, very aggressive, and for the past 1 month, inspired by us, it has been getting in reports of corruption about Kyrgyzstan and has been publishing them.
So that's a domino effect. Do you think the American government will get you?
I don't think so, but only because we have a lot of support. Yeah. It really is like that. We have people supporting us, doing a lot at various levels, from demonstrations in the street to just recently, just yesterday, 12 people went to an Obama fundraiser, paid $5,000 per person to sit at a table, and then all together got up and sung how unhappy they were with the White House's treatment of us and Bradley Manning, this alleged source who was in military prison. So that spectrum of support is what is keeping us strong, is what is keeping these forces at bay. They are very aggressively trying to get up a case in Virginia. That means detaining people many times for crossing the US border, raiding people around Boston, pulling records from Twitter and presumably Google and Facebook and all the other companies they can. So it is a conflict situation, but we have the overwhelming numbers. So we have the overwhelming support of the general public and most young journalists. And what our opponents have is organisation. So, for instance, the State Department internally is very organised. The FBI internally is very organised. Our supporters are spread all over the world. They're very, very numerous, but they are not yet very organised. But as time goes by, they are becoming more and more organised. They are meeting each other. They're making connections with each other. They are finding each other and starting to work out what they can do. And for example, this event that occurred at Obama's fundraiser, this is not something we organised. This is something our supporters organised by themselves. And as long as that tendency continues, then we will be in a position where it will be extremely hard for the United States to act.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Assange. Thank you very much. Thank you.